Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to see you because I can see you tonight. As you know, I'm Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and professor of Jewish Studies and History. And tonight is our third and last session of the mini course, Women in Yiddish Literature, being taught by Professor Anita Norwich. I think you've heard the introduction, but I will just mention her introduction again, and then I will give you the ground rules of tonight's meeting because it's different than the webinar form that we did for the first two sessions. So Professor Anita Norwich is the Tikva Frimer-Kensky Collegiate Professor Emerita of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She has spent her entire wonderful career working on Yiddish literature primarily, both in Yiddish literature produced in Eastern Europe and Yiddish literature produced in the United States. Her most recent book, Between Covers, is A Jewish Refugee in New York, and it's a translation of the Yiddish novel by Kadia Molodovsky, and it was published in 2019. Forthcoming, however, right, almost hot off the press, is a collection of stories by a writer named Hannah Blankstein. And this was published amazingly in Vilna, Poland in 1939 with a short introduction by the director of the YIVO Institute, Max Weinreich. And this is truly a find. This is an archival discovery and published source discovery of materials by a woman writer in Yiddish that no one has ever looked at before. And so this is going to be an extraordinary event when it comes out and Between Covers. And we look forward to hearing more from Professor Norwich about Hannah Blankstein. So just to reiterate, this is a meeting format tonight, and all of you are muted until the question and answer portions of the course. So when you want to ask a question, and we're gonna pause after the text by Malka Lee, you should raise your hand, as it were. And the way to do that is on the bottom of your screen to the far right. You should see reactions, an emoji with a little smiley face. And at the very bottom, it says raise hand. So you'll press that and I will see that. And then I or my aide-de-camp, Gabriel Duke, will spotlight you. And so you can ask the question directly to Professor Norwich. I ask that you ask questions, right? Please don't use this moment to give a long excursus on something, because there are a lot of you and we really want it to be interactive. So ask a question, keep it concise, and Professor Norwich will address it more than with great joy to do that. And you will of course unmute yourself. And then when you're done, go back into your mute room. In the Zoom room, go into your mute room. The mini course has been recorded, all the first two sessions, and this one will be as well. So you'll be able to revisit it and the texts. And we really appreciate your having your cameras on to make it feel like a classroom. I want to thank the Sagner Family Foundation for supporting this mini course. And I want to thank Professor Anita Norwich, of course, for joining us. I want to thank Gabriel Duke, who's been behind the scenes and so helpful in all aspects technological. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Professor Norwich, and I'll come back to moderate the chat, and then at the end to say a few comments about upcoming programs at the Bildner Center. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Professor Sinkoff. Can everyone hear me? I can see you nodding if you say yes. It really is a pleasure to see some people. I know some of you do not have your cameras on, and that's okay too, but if you are so moved, it would be wonderful to actually see reactions and see faces in this kind of format. So I am once again going to try speed speaking in order to really address these materials as quickly and as effectively as possible. And I just want to go over some of the things that we have been looking at up to now. As I've said by now, perhaps too many times, if the expectations of women's writing is that they'll give expression to so-called women's issues, that is, women's bodies, women's struggles, women as mothers, as wives, as partners, and also that they'll have a lot of understandable complaints about their treatment in the world, and especially in the Jewish world and the literary world, where again, you'll remember they're expected to write in certain ways from the women's section, poetry, their own experiences, etc. And we've certainly seen a great deal of that. And we're gonna see a little bit more of that, but we're also going to see something very different than these expectations today. We saw it in these expectations about, or these writings about, specifically about women and women's concerns. We saw it in the Trinis, the first thing that you can nod at any point because I can actually see you nodding enthusiastically, which gives me great joy. So we saw it in the Trinis, in the petitionary prayers, right? Where there were requests that were quite specific to women. We saw it in in Brachas's view of the Zugerin, of the speaker, who is put upon by the rest of the community and who gets nothing in return. We saw it perhaps most emphatically in the Anna Margolin poem, Ich bin gewesen einmal a Jingel. I was once a lad, a young boy, a youth. There were various versions of that. And you'll remember that there, the desire was to be anything except Jewish and female, right? Greek, Roman, everything but. We saw it as well in Friedel Stock's view of the chokehold of the wedding veil, right? And even the question of whether women are partly responsible for the oppressiveness of this institution, right? And we saw it in Dropkin's view of both the erotics and the dangers of women's writing, or how they're accepted or not. And there we talked about the ways in which eros and thanatos are intertwined, right? The desire for death and the desire for the free life of the body. And we also saw it, and we'll see another version of it in a little bit, in Tussmann's, in Malka Heifetz Tussmann's insistence that we listen to what's actually being said rather than to what we assume should be said, right? About compassion, about widowhood, about silence, about speech itself. So this is a quick run through of where we've been. And to that, I would like to add what I hope you can see. Yes, you can all see this, right? Again, heavy nodding. Thank you. So now I can't see most of you, but you can see the screen. So where I wanted to begin today was with Esther Singer Keitman, who is referred to correctly as the older sister of both Isaac Bashevis Singer and I.J. Singer, the brother Singer, who are more well known than she. And you read the story, The New World, here, where if you just read the title, you might have expected a view of America, right? What's the new world? But in fact, the new world is simply being in the world. Let me say a few words about Esther Keitman, because she's so little known. There are many critics who say that the story Yentl is based on Esther Keitman, which may or may not be true. It's certainly not something that Bashevis Singer himself ever said, but the position of women who are not allowed to study, who are who have those expectations that we've been seeing these last couple of weeks placed upon them, is certainly a concern, both in this story and in Keitman's life and work more fully. On the first day, it feels like it's been forever. It's only been twice. But on the first day, I quoted some of the critics and what they were saying about women's poetry. Right. And now I just want to flesh that out a little bit more. I want to just quote two things that Isaac Bashevis Singer said about his sister. And they're just listen to the, well, I'm going to translate it, but listen to the language. He said, and I quote, I'm quoting from the English translation of My Father's Courtyard. Bashevis said about Kreitman, she did not write as well as I.J. Singer. He adored his older brother. He worshiped his writing. She did not write as well as I.J. Singer, but I do not know of a single woman in Yiddish literature who wrote better than she did. If you're looking for backhanded compliments, write that down and use it sometime. The other thing that he said was, or another thing that he said was, she was a quite talented authoress, Schreiberin, authoress, and wrote several books that were not at all bad. They're just, you can't make this stuff up. So this is sort of what she was dealing with. And yet she was quite productive. She translated, she moved to Brussels. She got married to somebody she shouldn't have married. And was in Brussels, in Antwerp, sorry, and in London for many years. And in London, she translated two things, which will also give you a sense of who she was. She translated Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol into Yiddish, and she translated George Bernard Shaw's Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism into Yiddish. Neither of these were likely to endear her to the larger Yiddish population, the larger Yiddish group, readers, sorry. But her concerns went, much further than the condition of women issue. There's a wonderful, her longest novel is a novel called Der Scheidemtanz, The Dance of the Demons. And there's a wonderful, sad, but interesting comparison there that she makes between the condition of women in Jewish life and the condition of Hasidim in Jewish life. Not something that you often see as a comparison. And what she said about both of them is women and Hasidim are kept ignorant of the wider political and social world. They have to rebel against the position that they have in order to be educated. They were both in desperate need of education, and education took the form, obviously, of reading non-religious texts, but it also took the form of involvement in socialism, in romance, sex, and that comparison, I think, says a great deal about her. You read the story, The New World, which is taken usually as autobiographical. And this brings us also back to that first session that we had, where women's literature was considered autobiographical. It is true that she had very bad eyes. Whether this is, and her son said that this was because of this scene that she wrote into this story. Whether or not that is true, it is very difficult to ascertain at this distance, right? That is, what is true about the story is a feeling of being neglected and put under a table and left to basically rot there, with no stimulation and not even cleanliness. But the story itself is a really interesting one. It reads like a postmodern story. Here is this character who is relating her life before the moment of birth, right? She's entering into the new world. those of you who, I don't know that there are many people who still do this, but those of you who read 18th century English novels, which I spent many decades doing, it may connect this to the writing of Lawrence Sterne and Tristram Shandy, which has the same kind of conceit, that is, let me tell you the story of my life moment by moment. That's what you expect in an autobiography. That is impossible. I've barely gotten born here. And what have I gotten born into? The urge in that story, beginning on page 1, is to get out. Let me out of here into a better world. But of course, the world that she enters is not a better world. There's animals that, sorry, there are humans that are compared to animals, not the other way around, right? Her mother gives birth in the same bed as the cat gives birth. That cannot be a good sign. But it does show something about the status. There's also an interesting moment in the story, which I'm sure most of you caught. Her mother can't breastfeed her. This is a sign of class more than anything else, right? That is, she is sent out to a nursemaid to nurse her, and that's how she winds up under the table. So the emotional force of that scene, I think, it trumps any view of whether or not this is autobiographically true. Was her bad sight caused by spiders under the table and dust? Nobody really knows. But what interests me is that it was taken to be historical fact. Okay, I'm going to jump right past and come back for questions a bit later, because what I also want to talk about is the ways in which women writers, like men, were caught up in the political and social issues of the day. That is, that the writing that they did was not only or primarily even about the condition of women, it was about the condition of the world as well. And there's a poem, the poem that I gave you by Malka Lee, I think gives one of very many examples of that reality. So Malka Lee was born into a Galician, a Galiciana Hasidic family, and she came to New York in 1921. She was also married to another Yiddish poet named, Yiddish writer named Aaron Rappaport. And here again, we have one of those women's stories about her life, at least, not about her writing so much, which is that her father, who was a strict Chassid, her father at some point secretly burned all of her poetry when she was still living at home. He burned it because he thought it was against God's will for a girl to be writing. So we've got that to contend with as well. But the poem that I asked you to look at is called God's Black Lamb by Malka Lee. And I think I'm going to read it in English because I can't, oh no, I can't, yeah, I'm going to read it in English, sorry, and then I'll go to the Yiddish in a moment. They led him outside with bare feet and bound hands, his skin burnt by southern sand. His flesh became suddenly oily, his black body sparkled in tears. The woods bent as if from a knife wound going backward. Go back, God's black lamb, tore himself from the rope. This is how they bound his grandfather to a tree. Bilious foam on his lips, fists like axes swinging in space. Tom plays the wind on his teeth. Around him dance human dogs, For every dog a bone, his body is nothing more than clay. And already estranged from his own body, he gives himself over to, oh, great. Sorry, folks. He gives himself over to dog-like hands, a figure in the middle of the night when running across the dark wood, her body notched like black earth, the road is painted red. Where have they all gone? Trees with axes and knives, but one tree bleeds down to its trunk. Above, God's black lamb succumbs, her son, her Tom. This obviously is about lynching, right? And it was written, there's a whole body of Yiddish literature that was written not just about the situation, the plight of Black men and women in the United States, but that were also written in response to the Scottsboro Boys trial. Right. In 1932, 9 Black teenagers were accused of having raped 2 white women. And they didn't. But it took another 5 years until the last one was finally freed. And there were many scandals around the Scottsboro trial, not least of which was the fact that the only men on the trial, all the men on the trial were white. And there was clear evidence that the women had lied. But in any case, this is a direct response to Scottsboro. And there are 2 things in particular that I want to point to here. One is God's black lamb. The Lamb of God is actually a Christian image, right? Jesus is the Lamb of God who, according to the Gospel of John, who takes away the sin of the world. So here, Malka Lee is making of him the martyr Jesus. But there's another thing that I think is more obscure and I think more interesting. So here we have the Yiddish, and I know not all of you can read Yiddish. Can you see that? Okay, we're just jumping right along here. You can't see the bottom.
We can see Il Zun Il Tom.
You can see that?
Yeah,
That's what I want. Okay, where do you see that? Okay.
I can see at the bottom.
Excellent, that's what I want to see. So Il Zun Il Tam. If you're saying, and look at how it's spelled, again, this is for those of you who know Yiddish well enough to care. It's Tam with a pasach aleph, right? It's pronounced Tam. And if you say Tam in Yiddish, you're invoking an entire cultural world that is not the same as the one in English and the Black Lamb, right? You're invoking the simple son of the Passover story, right? Tam ma'omer. What does the simple son say? The simple son says, what is this? And that's really the question of the poem, right? Tam also invokes a Hasidic story by Rebbe Nachman about the Chacham and the Tam, the wise man and the simple man, who was, of course, who turns out to be wiser than the wise man and more successful than the wise man. But what she's doing in the Yiddish is, I think, pointing to this question of, what is this? What are you doing? Now, there's a problem here because she's also pointing to Tom as a simple son, which is problematic. There's been a lot written, which I'm sure many of you have read. There's been a lot written about the way in which Yiddish literature in particular engaged with the figure of African Americans, right? And whether this sympathetic response to the plight of African Americans of African Americans in the United States was a way of identifying with them, right? The kind of, we were the Blacks of Eastern Europe. We understand this situation. I'm speaking now in the voice of many of these writers. We understand this situation because we've been there, or whether it was a way of distancing themselves from this situation by saying, we're not them, right? These are different people. Whichever way you go, the sympathy, whichever way you understand this, the sympathetic response in this poem seems quite clear, and the problematic nature of some of that response is also quite clear. Yiddish writers, Malka Lee among them, recognize the African American experience as a way of claiming their own status as Americans too. I'm gonna stop here for a bit to see if there are any questions. And now I have completely lost you.
No. We
You're
should all
there.
be.
I got it.
Yeah,
I
we
got
should
it.
be.
Okay,
So
so this
if
is
you-
where you need to go to reactions, hit reactions, or if you're on
Right.
screen, you can also wave.
And, feel free to, ask a question, a sort of a textual question. If there's a line of the poem that interests you or engages you, there's so much in these two, so fabulous, right? So don't hesitate. Professor Norwich loves nothing better than that. Any good literary scholar loves nothing better than that. So if there's, or anything that's surprising to you, I think that many people don't know the historical reality of wet nurses, that this is commonplace. It's a phenomenon, we know a lot about it. So what does it mean for a woman to imagine herself being breastfed by someone who's not her mother? Naomi, is that a question? I saw a hand, but you need to, I don't see a hand on your screen and you're muted. Okay, yeah.
This doesn't work.
If you read 19th century novels, that's the norm, that the mother sends the
Right.
child out.
Right.
That was one thing. Now, I just wondered whether you made any connection between the Kreitman and the recent Ian McEwan book, Nutshell, where he has a fetus speaking through the entire thing with great dismay.
I wasn't making the comparison with that because my head is still in the 18th century, which tells you more about me than you need to know. But this is a conceit that you see again, not again and again, but that you see, right? And it both challenges what we think of as autobiography, right? We think autobiography is telling you about your, well, I can't tell you everything about my life in the 200 pages that I have before me. And I'll make a mockery of that by going minute by minute. And then there is the fantasy of what the fetus expects once out in the world. And of course, the expectations and the realities couldn't be more different in that story, at least.
Right. May I say one other thing? I don't want to be a hog, but in the Malka Lee with the black lamb, it didn't, I know Agnes Day, of course, but I thought about Isaac and the lamb coming in instead of him. That was my initial association. So I want to thank you for correcting that misreading.
Well, okay, so this is part of a polemic. It's not a misreading. I don't mean to suggest that it's a misreading. What I was trying to suggest is that her imagination and her influences are rooted in the world that she lives in, which is both the Jewish world and the American world. And this is always the case with these writers. We tend to, ask questions of them like, well, how many children did they have? Was she a good mother? How religious was she? And what Malka Lee is saying is that she's both. and thank you for bringing in, of course, the Isaac story, right? It's not that Christians have a monopoly on the lamb, but the invocation of the innocent lamb who redeems sins, and of course, in the comparison between lynching and crucifying is not a subtle one either. I'm going to call you by the names that appear here, if that's all right.
We have another question. We have
Yes,
Lois as her
I
hand
saw.
up, right? And then Betsy, I see.
Okay. There's so much humor in the new world.
Thank you.
You know, even as it's very disturbing, and she makes a real critique about how she's being treated, at the same time, there is so much humor, her satire about the women visitors and how they pretend that they don't want to eat and all that kind of thing. And it is just an interesting combination.
Yeah.
Does it mute the criticism or make us more willing to look at the criticism because we've had some relief?
Those are very good questions. And the answer to both is partially yes, right? But it also, it also reflects the combination that Keitman herself possesses. That is to say, both in her writing, in her life, and in her political sympathies, which is to say, she's very critical of very many things in this Jewish world, particularly as it pertains to women, but she's also part of it. And she's not distancing herself from the whole thing. She's a reformist, and I mean, one could say that she's a reformist in this regard, right? She's not only critical. That's a good observation. I see Betsy.
Betsy and then Esther.
And then I'm going to want to move on. Betsy, you're muted. On the bottom left of your screen, you can unmute.
Yeah, I got it.
There you go.
So in light of what you were saying about her status in relation to her brothers, I was wondering about her relationship to those men, and how would they respond? I mean, this is an amazing story about, you know, the very beginning as a woman. So I was just curious if there's anything about that. Yeah.
They didn't respond. The response that we got were those two things that I cited, right? She was, you know, she wasn't as good as a singer. She wasn't as good as IJ, but she was the best among the women. And Bashevis Singer also said she wrote really good letters home. But about her creative writing, look, she was also considered, you know, the mad woman in the attic image. Bashevis did say something else about her. He said that she was a very difficult woman and girl, and that she either that she was subject to nervous breakdowns. She did suffer from depression that we have other evidence of, and she had some form of epilepsy, which again may or may not be true. Or, you know, those were the excuses. She was hysterical, she had epilepsy, or she was possessed by a dibuk. That's my favorite one.
Right. All very
it was
dismissive. Yeah, very dismissive and typical.
Look, it was not a happy family. We'll talk about that on some other, maybe on another occasion. But the relationships, other than the brothers, everybody else was what we now call dysfunctional.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Esther Ehrman. who also needs to unmute.
Okay,
There you go.
I'm actually right now, I'm reading Anne Seba's book about Ethel Rosenberg. And I saw that Kreitman died in 1954, which was
Correct.
after the execution. And I'm wondering, was there any writing among the Jewish women about the Ethel Rosenberg?
There were, she wasn't one of them. I mean,
Yeah.
she was in England at the time, and I don't know, I don't know that she ever wrote about that. But again, these writers were responding to the issues of the day. There isn't much that I know of the Rosenbergs, which was, of course, a problematic issue for Jews to take on, and for Yiddish writers to take on. But she did not respond to that. She was writing about primarily Antwerp, and she wrote about the Blitz in London, about World War II, when she was in London. Okay.
Okay,
Sorry.
so you're ready to share your screen and move on to Katya?
That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen. I can't move the video while I don't know what that means. Okay.
But at the bottom, yeah, there you go.
Am I sharing the screen?
You were sharing your screen, but you can make it full so that we
Yeah,
don't
I
see.
know. Yeah, I play from the current slide, but I don't want to play from the current slide. Okay, so really, I've been doing this now for 2 years. You would think that I'd gotten it straight. Okay, so clearly one of the major themes that concerned Yiddish writers and others, women and men, were responses to the Holocaust, responses to the war, which almost every one of them who wrote about what was going on while they were here in America did not differentiate, did not distinguish between the plight of men and the plight of women. This is when they wrote more and more about the plight of Jews. That was the major concern. And one of the most famous of these poems, which was written actually first in 1944, near the end of the war, but not quite at the end, it was by Kaja Molodowski, for whom I have a very soft spot for reasons that Professor Sinkoff already mentioned in the translation. And here I'm really fascinated by the issue of translation and what happens. And I want to play that out a little bit. The poem that I'm referring to is a poem called El Hanun, God of Mercy, right? And it has a very clear beginning in Yiddish. El Hanun, Kleib ois ananda folk, God of mercy, choose another people. We've had enough. We're tired of this. Choose another one. Now, I want to show you two translations. This may be difficult to see on a screen, but I hope not. Two translations, both by Irving Howe.
We can see no problem.
Great. At a distance of about 20 years, right? By the way, if you're interested, you can go onto YouTube and hear Kaja Molodowski reading this poem in Yiddish. And it's worth listening to. So in 1969, Irving Howe translates this beginning as, "O God of mercy, for the time being, choose another people. We're tired of death, tired of corpses. We have no more prayers. For the time being, choose another people. We've run out of blood for victims. Our houses have been turned into desert. The earth lacks space for tombstones. There are no more lamentations nor songs of woe in the ancient texts." Quite declarative. But look at what happens to El Hanun Kleib ois ananda folk, der Veil. It's this word, you can see me circling this, it's this word that makes all the difference in the English translation. So in 69, what Irving House says is, for the time being, choose another people, right? For now, we're in mourning, now choose another people, right? What Molodowski is actually saying, and what he is finally able to assert 20 years later, is doubling down on this rejection of chosenness. God of mercy, choose another people. Choose another. Right? There's no for the time being. Now, there are a couple of ways to understand this, this difference. The simplest one is that he misunderstood this word. And he and then somebody called him up. Somebody called him up and said, that's not what it says, Irving, right? He saw this word as the word derweil, which means in the meantime, for now. But the word is actually derweil, which means to vote, to choose, to elect, right? And the difference is simply something that's often missing in Yiddish print, although it shouldn't be. It's a question of accent, and it's a question of a pasach, of a little line under these two little letters. That changes the word from der Veil, vote, to derweil, in the meantime. And he put it as in the meantime. Now, that might explain this, this problem. He didn't get it. He didn't get it. But the last lines, you cannot attribute to that. Oh, God. Okay, really, I'm very well organized. Okay, the last lines you can't see is that the last lines say in Yiddish, "Nimm zu von uns die Schrine von Gaones." Now you hear two foreign words, two incorporated words from the Hebrew in this last line, right? Noch ein chesed tu zu uns, do us one more favor, one more favor, God of mercy. Nimm zu von uns die Schrine von Gaones. Now, in 1969, he says, God of mercy, grant us one more blessing. Take back the gift of our separateness. Now, this is not a translation error. This is a choice. There is no way on earth to go from Shechina and Gaonis to gift and separateness. It's just not a translation. It's an interpretation. It's an adaptation. It's a correction maybe. What he says in 87 is take back the Shechina, which is the divine immanence, the feminine aspect of God, the divine, he translates it now as the divine glory of our Gaonis, of our genius. This is a more literal translation. So what accounts for this? This isn't, he missed a little diacritical mark here. What's happening here between in these 20 years, and I don't want to go too much into this, although it's fascinating to me, is changes in translation theory and changes in ethnic identity in America. And I'll just start with the second one. After Roots, by the 70s, ethnic identity is being claimed by more and more groups. The assertion of difference, which, well, I won't comment. The assertion of difference is becoming much stronger. So what you couldn't say, there's an expression in Yiddish that says, "Es passt nicht vor de Goyim." it means it's just not appropriate to say this in front of non-Jews, right? So in 1969, to claim divine glory is mine, to claim genius is my people's, is a little too much. It's not, they're not going to like this if we do that. In translation, right? Molodowski claims it quite clearly, right? The Schreine von Gaonis, there's no ambiguity there. So that's one thing. We hadn't yet come culturally to a moment where you could claim these kinds of superiorities, right? The other thing that's happening in translation is that there's a move also in the same decade, in the 70s, more or less. There's a move away from making translations seem like they could have been written in English. Let's not make the reader work too hard, because who knows what they're going to get. I'm going to tell them everything that they need to know. Now, or in recent decades, we've gone back to an earlier understanding of translation, which is, let's make sure the reader knows that this is not in fact your culture, and that you have to learn to understand another group's culture. Not everything needs to be made seamless for the English American reader. But for me, the strong point here is what Molodowski is able and willing to say in Yiddish, that at some point English readers aren't understood to be able to get, right? And this is something that I would say much more broadly of Yiddish literature, that because it's written for an internal audience, because it's written for, in Yiddish we say eigene, one's own, because of all of that, the criticism is much stronger, much more direct than seemed appropriate. Particularly seemed appropriate in English after the war, right? This is, these are the years when we're getting these myths of the shtetl, and you can't criticize pre-war Jewry after the war, except in Yiddish, where you can make these distinctions. And this is an incredibly powerful poem. That Kleibois another folk, choose another people, is a dramatic statement to be made here. I see a hand, but I'd like to move on to the next, briefly, to the next poem, so that I have time for it, but I'm leaving plenty of time. I wanted to add on one more poem by Malka Heifetz, sorry, by Malka Heifetz Tussman, a poem called Tzolachis, in spite, or deliberately, or on purpose. There are many ways to interpret this. And this too, you'll remember that Tussman was the one who wrote the poem Widowhood, and the sea tore, what did it say? The sea tore a rib from its side, the Adam and Eve one, the one that says, listen to me, don't assume that because you hear the word, you understand what it is that I want or need. And this is very much in keeping there, but it's also very much about Yiddish and about the condition of women, right? You say, can I read this in Yiddish while you follow it? Because you have them both. Is that okay? Okay. I only see like 4 people and they're nodding, so I'm going with them. Tzolachis. And you can follow it line by line. Du sagst, du bist Jid und bist Dichter und schreibst nicht kein Lieder von Choben. Wie kann das ein jüdischer Dichter, wenn so groß ist der Choben? Poshet. Auf Tzolachis die verwieste, auf Tzolachis will ich nicht weinen befriese, auf Tzolachis auf Papier nicht aufschreiben, mein Treue. A Busche aufzuschreiben, Treue auf Papier. Auf Zoloches will ich herumgehen in der Welt, wie sie gewähnt wollt meine. A wade meine, wem ist denn? Wird man mir sterben, verzäumen mir die Weg, wird sie noch alt sein, meine. Wo denn? Nicht meine? Auf Zoloches will ich nicht jammern, wenn viele die Erde von mein Welt soll Chalide mir wären, die Kreis wie mein Säul, was steht auf ihr. Wird sie noch als sein meine, oi, noch wie meine. Auf Zoloches will ich Hassene machen Kinder, als sie sollen euch haben Kinder. Auf Zoloches die Rescheim, was plodien sich in mein Welt und machen sie mir eng. Okay, there's a lot more going on in this poem than I'm going to have time for, but it's another one of these that I just can't resist. Here's what I find most powerful in this poem. It's exactly these lines. A Busche aufzuschreiben, Treue auf Papier. This is a post-war poem. This is the expectation of Yiddish writers and of Jews. Your job now is to mourn and to write about the destruction. I'm not saying that's not your job, but she is saying that's not my only job, right? Don't think that because I'm a Jew and a poet, I have to write poems about Churban, about catastrophic destruction. But there's also a give and take here that's painful. That is to say that you're doing this to spite everybody is highly problematic. To say that you're going to have children and grandchildren to spite them, not in spite of them, but to spite them, is highly problematic. And here too, the tension, what happened here? Okay, here too, the tension is much worse, much stronger, in the Yiddish, because you'll see, even if you don't read Yiddish, you'll see these question marks, right? Nicht meine, wem ist denn? Whose then? Isn't it mine? That's a question that actually requires an answer. Is the world still mine? In English, the assertion is, of course it's mine. Not as if the world were mine, isn't it mine? Do you hear the difference between of course it's mine and isn't it mine? Right? Isn't it mine invites the reader to think about that question and to respond to it. And of course it's mine says, the hell with all these people who want me to do X and Y. I'm going to do exactly what they don't want me to do. To spite them, I will go on living and have children and grandchildren. And I think what she's insisting on in this poem is something that we should always keep in mind about Jews, about women, and about literature, three things that are very dear to my heart, right? Which is to say, don't expect that you know what's coming when you hear the word Jew, woman, or literature. This really requires deep listening and interpretation. Okay, now I can take questions.
So Sally has her hand up and Naomi had her hand up. So we'll take Sally first just because Naomi, you spoke before, is that right? Yeah, go ahead. So Sally, you're on, I'm unmuting you. I'm asking you to unmute, yeah.
Thank you, yes. I noticed in your second reading of this poem that the line that follows in the Yiddish follows, of course it's mine, whose else would it be, is left out in the translation.
Right, it's the
What
same
impact do you think that has? Was that a special reason for that?
No, I don't know that there was a special reason for that leaving out, but maybe because I'm speculating here, that Yiddish has more of a tolerance for repetition in literature than does English, right? Yiddish allows for more of that. So she's doubling down again on that question. And what bothers me, bothers is a little strong, what I question is the elimination of the question, right? That these are not, I mean, the rhetoric of questions and the rhetoric of assertion are very different in every imaginable way. So this is what you've noticed is very much in keeping with that declarative, but not interrogative, not questioning nature.
But another question might have opened it up to speculation. Who else might have
Right,
ownership of
right.
this?
The same way is the same in exactly the same way that, you know, isn't it mine? I mean, I know that you're supposed to answer, isn't it mine, with, yeah, of course it is,
Yes.
but it does raise the question.
Mhm.
And questions always have more than one answer if they're good
Right.
questions.
Right. Thank you. Mhm.
Naomi, you need to unmute.
Okay, you know, I was a little confused by your interpretation of theory of translation regarding Molodovsky, because coming from, I'm an observant Jew, so to me, the notion of chosenness was really much more Jewish and religiously Jewish, while the other translation, what you view as more accurate, is being, I view that as a more secular peoplehood, ethnic translation, because this is what has messed us up all these years. To me, the poem had more cohesion when it is strictly about that notion of chosenness, which has just gotten us into so much trouble.
I'm sorry,
In other words, we as Jews have been besieged because of the notion of chosenness and the envy that Christians have over our covenantal relationship with God. So I viewed that as the more assertive the more assertive interpretation, to summon up chosenness rather than an ethnic description of Jews are all smart and stuff like that.
Are you talking about the Molodovsky poem here?
Yes, I'm sorry. I should have labeled that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's right.
She's talking specifically about, but it's Irving Howe made the distinction. Let's be clear.
Yes. But I just thought that was that process was interesting, that he goes from her to him, back to her in a certain sense. Because I felt that chosenness actually is the more assertive, is the more direct way, even if it's not the closest to what she was doing. And I was just trying to align that with your theories of how translation has changed.
Okay, what I was trying to suggest is that the hesitation of "for the time being"
surely
is what's problematic here. I mean, actually it's not problematic, it's wrong. But it signifies differently, right? They're both talking about the chosenness of, both of these translations, like Molodovsky's Yiddish, are talking about the chosenness of the Jewish people. But the assertiveness is really in this bottom. And
yes, exactly.
It's also important, it's important to underscore, both for these women and for much of Yiddish literature, that this is a little bit, this is a good Jewish tradition arguing with God. What have you chosen us for, right? We don't have to go back all the way to Job. So it's not, these writers are not distancing themselves from the language or the ideas or the literature of the Jews.
Right, okay.
That they're not doing. They have to contend with it. But what she's saying here is precisely, I think this may be what you were getting at, is precisely, we are the chosen people. Look, sorry, there are a number of poems by one of my favorite poets, Yankiv Gladstein, another Yiddish poet, which say, and I think she's in that mode, and Molodowski's in that mode as well, which say, look, there's a it says it much more poetically, but there's a covenant between God and the Jewish people. If the Jewish people have been destroyed, with whom does God have a covenant? The poem that I'm thinking of in particular, and I'm sorry this takes us a little bit away, is a poem that begins, Die Teure, I'll translate it in a moment, Die Teure haben mir Mekabel gewein auf den Sinai und in Lublin haben mir sie zurückgegeben. We received the Torah on Sinai, and in Lublin, we returned it. And then he cites one of the Psalms, Lo ametim hallelujah, nicht die Teute leugnen Gott. It's not the dead who praise God. What the Psalm says is praise was given to the living. So if you follow the logic of Mount Sinai, and all of us were there at the giving of Mount Sinai, you have to follow the logic of Lublin, that all of us were there at Lublin.
Yes.
And Molodowski is following the logic of chosenness. If we are the chosen people, you should tell us what we've been chosen for, because this can't be it. So take it all back.
Thank you. So may I ask one other thing? So is that the reason why she has Lublin in here? Or is that just a coincidence?
Hold that up again. That's advertising. It's free advertising. No, I'm kidding. I'm not sure. I've been asked this before, and she wasn't in Lublin. She was in Warsaw. But Lublin was bombed earlier, so perhaps within the plot that makes sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have time, I think, Lois, for one more question, and that's it.
Party's over, folks. Yeah.
You said that to spite them was problematic, but isn't it common for people to feel that going on with their lives, having children and grandchildren, is an act of resistance?
Yes.
To what was done to us?
Yes.
So is it problematic or not?
I would say yes to both of those things. That is, yes, it is a sign of continuity, of regeneration, of, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live, the Jewish people live. But to say all of this with the word of tzalachas, right, to spite them, I'm going to do this, as opposed to renew, I'm going to do this, is where I feel a hesitation. I want to say one other thing. This is the view that is often presented about life in the DP camps after the war, and the displaced persons camps in Europe after the war. The DP camps in Europe after the war had the highest birth rate of any recorded civilization in modern history. I'm going to let that sink in for just 1 second. Right, the highest birth rate. And the explanation for that was often, is often, they were rebuilding lives. They were repopulating the Jewish world, and they were, resisting what had been done to them in a very strong way. And that's true. But what's also true is that the people who survived were of childbearing age. The very young and the very old were not in the DP camps until they were born in the DP camps. So we're always with, two or more things going on at the same time, right? It's resistance. It's also a little biology. It's renewal. It's also in spite. You know, when your kid says, to spite you, I'm going to go to, I don't know, college. I'm going to move to Israel. I'll show you, right? You know, you're proud that they're doing this, but why are you doing this to spite me? So I think there's something similar going on here in this tension. And what she's asking, what they're all asking is, don't tell me what or how I should be. You need to watch it. You need to read it. I need to write it, and you need to interpret it in an open, with an open mind.
So I want to make a comment. I made it in the chat, Professor Norwich. Something just struck me that both Kadya Moldavsky's poem and Tussman invoke what's called, post-Holocaust theology. And it's so interesting. I'm thinking of Zach Braderman's work. I mean, there's quite a lot of scholarly literature in modern Jewish thought about the guys writing philosophy, Wiesel and Fackenheim and others. And if you don't look at, and women aren't doing that for the most part, right? They're not writing, philosophic discourses on the Shoah. I mean, they're probably wondering, Arendt. But here you have in the poetic writings, different kind of voice, but actually saying the same thing, right? Or challenging this whole issue is, don't let me tell you what I think about the Horban. Let me tell you what, and also in the Choose poem, shouldn't there be, or couldn't one have put a second choice? Choose already, because there's Kleib and then there's Del Veil, right?
Right.
So it could be even more emphatic.
I would have, I mean, not that anybody asked me, but I might have said, choose another people, elect another, to kind of double down in the way that she does. Kleib ois anander folk, der Veil.
Right. And it's two different verbs. So was she wanted? Yeah.
Right.
I think Esther has a question, but I'm cognizant of the time. And so perhaps you can send it to me and I'll forward it to Professor Norwich, because I know the time is running. And
I'm also on email,
Right. If you can find, it's not hard to find her.
No, I haven't been playing hard to get the last.
And she's teaching public and other forums. So I want to, obviously this was a great format, and I think we've learned something that with a group this size, even this size, we can do this. So that's terrific. So thank you very much, Professor Norwich.
Thank you for the invitation and for the engagement with the material, which means a lot.
Fabulous. I want to tell everyone that even though, we can do this. We can do
Is this what we do?
Yeah, there's a lot of different hand signals. I want to give everyone a heads up that we have several spring mini courses being organized by the Bildner Center. Adam Furtziger and my colleague Michal Rauscher are going to teach a 2-session course in February called Innovative Orthodoxies Between Israel and America on the changes in the Orthodox world. And Adam Furtziger sits in Israel, Michal Rauscher sits here in New Jersey, so it should be terrific. And Michal works on gender, and Adam works on a lot of different interesting things on struggles of Orthodoxy in Israel. Jonathan Deckel-Hen, who did our digital exhibit on Jewish agriculture in New Jersey, is going to teach a 2-session class that'll be much more in depth than he did for the launch on Jewish farming in New Jersey in February also, February 16th and 23rd. And we have a third mini course called The Saint, the Queen and the Joker, a brief introduction to Sephardic folklore, which is taught by a recently minted PhD from Israel, Dr. Ron Lasry. So just check the Bildner Center website, pay attention to the emails, e-blasts that come into your inbox. All of these courses can be registered. For all of these courses, you can register in January. We also have public programs, one-offs. February 1st, Laura Liebman, who won not one, but 3 National Jewish Book Awards for her last book, has written yet another book. It's called Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Family, multiracial Jewish family. That is on Tuesday, February 1st. And she may be in conversation with my colleague in history, Marisa Fuentes, or she'll be in conversation with me. But I hope Professor Fuentes will join her. And that's on a colonial Jewish family and their very complicated relationships of with interracial marriages and conversions. In late March, something a little lighter, sort of kinda, we're going to have author Dan Grunfield and his father, Ernie Grunfield, who apparently was the former general manager of the New York Knicks, about his book, Dan's book, By the Grace of the Game, The Holocaust, a Basketball Legacy, and an Unprecedented American Dream. And finally, there'll probably be some other things, but finally, my wonderful colleague, Rebecca Sipus in Mason Gross School of the Arts, who's a musicologist and musician, is presenting a program called Exile, Music and the Early Modern Jewish Diaspora. And this is based on musical scores from Italy. So we're doing a lot in the spring, but you have a break now. And again, I want to thank you all for coming, and particularly thank Professor Anita Norwich for this wonderful 3-session class.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So see you all, I hope, in Zoom land, unfortunately, in the spring.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.